good afternoon and good morning, everyone. This is Mark Seawald speaking, and as mentioned, I'm joined by my colleague Don. Don will be introducing himself in a moment here. I'm just going to start with a few words. I think this is hopefully a very informative presentation we have lined up for you. I think the profitability and cost management capability is really one of maybe the parts of the EPM cloud is not as well understood as other parts of the EPM cloud, but potentially one of the most powerful parts. So I think in particularly for those customers that are looking at the new pricing that we have, where everything within the EPM cloud is included part and parcel, hugely valuable. So first off, Don will go into this a lot more detail here, but it goes into some very key business process you'll see listed here, and it's part and parcel of the EPM cloud. A lot of, historically speaking, our customers may have looked at things like profitability analysis or shared service allocations and costing as things that maybe you would have done in the planning domain or using our planning and budgeting capability. And we talked a lot about that yesterday. If you attended our session towards the end of the day on planning and budgeting in the EPM cloud. PCM is purpose built to address these, and Don's going to walk you through this. You could certainly do it in planning, but we don't believe it's the right place to do these kind of business processes. A lot of thought and a lot of engineering has been put into really making a best practice process for these kind of business processes. So excited to bring this to you. And with that, that's really the major part of my contribution to this presentation. And we're going to pass it off to Don, who's the real expert in these business processes. So Don, thank you.
Hey, Mark, thanks so much. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for attending. I'm Don Bean, as advertised. I've been with Hyperion originally and now Oracle as part of this project team for quite some time. And we've seen the profitability and costing space go through a number of iterations, cloud being probably the most exciting one, as it brought the software as a service delivery mechanism, brought our capabilities to really underserved communities out there that weren't getting access to the tools they needed from their ledger system or even from their planning systems. I think cloud has been the most exciting part of my stay here at Oracle/Hyperion, and continues to be. So Mark alluded to a number of different areas where PCM for short gets used, and of course, from the name, profitability and profitability analysis is kind of the standard assumption about what it does. But you can see from what I've got on screen here, we get used in a lot of different ways that may be less obvious and clearly not indicated by the name of the process. So if I kind of break these categories down into what customers are looking to get from PCM, strategic profitability, again, the namesake of the product really, and the ability to get a multidimensional drillable profit and loss reporting capability with cost contribution detail is kind of the classic use case for PCM, and I would say maybe about a third of our users actually use it for that. And it gets used for decision support for market investments or where to retire products, pricing conversations, and cost optimization efforts if you find areas that aren't performing from a profitability standpoint as well as you thought they were. PCM also has the detail about costs contributing to help uncover the reasons why. Shared services is probably the largest use case that we've got, and we are commonly used to offload this process from the general ledger and sometimes from financial close and planning as well. The process of creating a waterfall of allocations to trickle overheads, indirects and semi-indirects from where they're booked in the ledger to where they're actually consumed and used as a chargeback capability is largely what this encompasses. So we get picked up, as I said, a lot of times just to relieve the general ledger of having to do this, and often are used to round trip this information from those other financial systems into PCM for the complex allocation processes and then results sent back. One of the new ones in the last couple of years, IT financial management, is really kind of an expanded version or a more in-depth version of shared services. The IT department is looking to use tools to reflect what it does more as a service provider, run itself more like a business. And in order to do that, again, they need to readjust how they're tracking expenses from which departments they're housed in into which services they provided. Similar to all of the above, really, tax transfer pricing is a more specialized use case in doing legal entity to legal entity. Allocations and recharges are really the same things, shared services or services housed in one legal entity, but performing actions to the benefit of others to get those expenses and recharges and markups pushed to the right legal entity so you can get accurate taxable income. Finally, probably the most hidden one, but one of the ones we see a lot of is regulatory costing. And this is for industries where how you book costs is influenced heavily by external regulators. So in the insurance industry, we'll see this especially in healthcare insurance. We'll see this in government contractors where they need to justify overhead rates. So any kind of regulated or semi-regulated industries, we see a lot of need for kind of a restatement of expenses to meet the regulatory reporting requirements that they have. So, in this presentation, I'm trying to give an overview here, and I know we've got a limited time. 45 minutes is not a lot of time, but the use cases really drive the interest for PCM. And there isn't an office of profitability. Sometimes there's a costing office, but sometimes they're doing other things. But these 5 use cases are really the prime drivers of customers getting into and adopting PCM into their business practices. The rest of the presentation, I kind of want to go into what PCM is. We don't really have the time to do a super deep dive demo, but I want to hit and highlight all of the functional areas where we've created utility and functionality to help users of Oracle Cloud EPM to perform the processes necessary to do what's necessary to be done to get PCM outputs created. Let me skip past that one. So, when we're faced with a situation where, expenses really don't line up to the way we need them to, and sometimes revenue too, for the reporting outputs that are required, typically we find ourselves in a situation where there is a logical cascade of allocations and transformations that has to be done in order to get the financial data that you've got into the shape you need for the reporting outputs you're looking for. So, this diagram represents a fairly typical flow of transformations to push those corporate overheads and shared service back office functions down to parts of the business that more directly relate to customers, markets, and products, and finally to those kind of market segments and dimensions that reflect where you're doing business, so that you can get the reporting outputs like you see at the bottom. And not every customer is using PCM exactly the same way, so dimensions and market segments obviously change. The reporting outputs change, but the flow is typically pretty similar. And it requires a lot of data, both from your financial systems as well as operational systems, sometimes from other EPM systems, and sometimes just from people. So the process we're trying to support is this waterfall of changes to your financial data. And we've broken it down into kind of five steps to get the job done, and then of course designed product and functionality around these steps to help support users that are doing it. First step, design, and this is probably the longest step in the process, and in many ways the least obvious. Design starts with thinking about what your usage is, what your outputs need to be, what dimensionality you need for those outputs, and also maybe what dimensional changes you need to the data that you already have that you may need to revise, summarize, or get more detail in many cases, or introduce new dimensions that are kind of intermediate steps, like function-oriented dimensions to help attribute your expense groups and cost centers by kind of what they do versus where they report. Second step, once you've got your design in place, you need to integrate data. And as I mentioned earlier, data from a lot of places. Financial data, obviously we're going to start with data from the ledger. Operations data for drivers, surveyed inputs, again, usually for drivers. And the hierarchies and attributes that you're going to use in your design are often sourced from other master systems that are the true keepers of those hierarchies. Third, we're going to compute. We need to design transformations and allocations to help get the data from where it resides to where it needs to reside for reporting purposes. There's always a sequential aspect to this, and controlling that sequence is a key part of doing this well. And with anything where we're doing this level of transformation, once you do validation, there are often the needs to reverse, revise, recalculate. And so, making that process simple to do and with as little as impact on reporting users and other external users as possible. Once computed, we need to validate. Validate results, validate the impact of metadata changes, validate performance, be able to provide information to third parties and others internally to vet the process and make the process as transparent as possible. And finally, when we've got results, analysis of those results, profit by segments, the costing burdens, the cause and effect of how those numbers came to be, and the potential for creating alternate scenarios for other levels of analysis and business test cases. So there's a lot that goes into managing this process. And there was, a whole world of functionality that we could create to help users get this job done. So what I'm going to go through today in the remaining time is kind of hit the highlights of the functional areas that we've got. Obviously, like I said, I can't do a deep dive demo, but hopefully if you've got those use cases, I'll give you enough information to take the next step, which is to get one of those deep dive demos from our sales team. So ideally, I can give you enough information to work with going forward. First step, design. And the first step there is obviously thinking through your reporting needs and your allocation needs, and then coming up with a structure that's going to help you deliver on both of those. So, structure for us in the EPM world is largely based on dimensions. And so we're going to start with dimensions from your financial system. And you may adopt them as is. You may exclude some. You may simplify some of the hierarchies you're working with. You may expand some, because the hierarchies that you have in your financial system were built for its best needs, but not necessarily for this process's needs. So we'll give you the ability to diverge somewhat from what you're working with in your ledger. We'll give the opportunity to add operations dimensions. So services, projects, function dimensions, and others are segments that may not exist in your ledger, but are necessary for creating a true cause and effect allocation flow. And so inserting those here is the next step. And finally, adding market dimensions, product, channel, customer, region, service, branch, what have you, things that describe the end objects that you're trying to measure. In a profitability use case, these are often the same ways that you track revenue. In some of these other use cases, it may be slightly different. Tax may be more legal entity oriented and region oriented, but in the end, there's an end point that you're trying to get to with your data, and those market or endpoint dimensions are things you're typically adding and extending out your financial data across. Finally, time and version dimensions, so that we can track data by period or by scenario or by version of scenario and so on. Expanding on this, the ability to create alternate hierarchies within these dimensions is a really useful tool for both reporting purposes, but also for managing your rules. So often I'll see customers creating an org dimension that they're really inheriting from their financial system, but the org hierarchy is set up based on the nature of the control of the funds, but not necessarily the nature of the function. So creating an alternate hierarchy in the org dimension or cost center dimension for function gives you a great tool for then building rules that key off of that hierarchy rather than the traditional hierarchy. Attribute dimensions, of course, also can be used for reporting primarily. We also use them occasionally for rule filtering. So the whole design of your structure up front, there's a lot you can do to build that structure to expand your reporting capability, but also to enhance your ability to build rules. And one of the key things here is this design is open. It's not fixed by what you see in the ledger or planning or financial close. You can rebuild a whole structure here specifically for this process to make it as easy to manage as possible. Next step, defining rules. And rules for PCM are largely two types of rules. One custom calc rules or allocation rules, actually I skipped over a wonderful section here. Part of the transformation process that you can build into these applications can actually happen on import, and we'll talk about integration in a second. But one of the very useful features is the data exchange capability that allows you to do some modifications of your data as it comes in, even before we start to approach it with rules. So often for management reporting purposes, we don't need to see account level detail, or often don't need to see even cost center level detail. We can aggregate those values into cost pools. And so data management is a great way to build that mapping and aggregation on import so that we can iron out some of that detail that we don't need. We use custom drivers and custom calculations to derive values that we're going to need for subsequent rules, like drivers. And finally, creating a waterfall of rules that defines your process from start to finish. And you see the screen grab there on the right gives a little indication of what the waterfall looks like. But sequence is important in anything allocation oriented. And so you build out that sequence in the UI. You build it with rules driven by business relationships, not defined by scripting. And, to do that, and that really the heart of building that process is building the rules. So this is an example of, the rule building UI. This is an allocation rule. And our intent here was to make rule building something that's a business analyst familiar with the data and familiar with the hierarchies could define without needing to learn the scripting language. And so all of the rules are based on hierarchies and hierarchy levels. So you can, for instance, in this example, the account dimension, we've picked operating expenses. There are a lot of children of operating expenses, but we simply selected all of them by selecting the parent. We can build out source and destination relationships that extend across new dimensions. If we've added dimensions to our data, we can build out an allocation that will do that split out across a new dimension. We can reallocate within dimensions, and even do so recursively if necessary. We'll find ourselves in shared service examples where that's the dominant use case for rules. All of the rules are data driven. So if we find driver data, we allocate. If we don't, we do not. So there's a variety of ways to control the endpoints of these allocations and the final output, both defined by the relationships defined in the rules, as well as the availability of driver data when we execute. All allocation rules create automatic offsets, so they automatically balance. And the other type of rules, custom calc rules, are very similar, but they're not a two-sided rule. They're simply making modifications of ranges of the application using a custom formula and a target range defined using hierarchies. So our intent here was to create a rule structuring capability that business users can use and define without relying on IT or IT-like resources to define, redefine, revise, update, and keep up to date. So one of the things we commonly find with customers converting from a legacy system, a homegrown system typically, is that the allocation logic, the transformation logic is dramatically out of date because it's difficult to keep up with business changes and get edits to the logic in the tool that it was written in. So we wanted to erase that problem. And that's true of homegrown systems. And quite honestly, it's true of some Hyperion systems as well. So we see customers that have built this on a custom S-Space cube and have done real artistry with CalcScript in BSO. The problem is you're reliant on that artist to update it. And that skill set becomes scarce because they're in high demand. And the changes to the business that impact changes to this allocation logic happen every month. So it's one of those situations where the script writers are happy to be done with this kind of project, and the business users that rely on those changes are happy to be on their own because it gives them freedom to update as they need to without relying on what essentially amounts to an external resource that has to be scheduled and budgeted for. So once we've got the model designed, managing that model over time is another challenge. So model management in PCM is built around the concept of the point of view. We've got a set of rules for every point of view combination. So every year, period, scenario, version, combination, et cetera, there is a set of rules specific to it. And that allows us to have rule versions specific to that point of view. It also allows us to create new points of view for scenario analysis and other purposes. And so we've built in a lot of tools to help manage that point of view process. We've got copy and clear functions built into the system, so we can copy rules, we can copy input data from one point of view to another. We can lock that point of view once we've computed, and we don't want to allow users to compute again. We want to lock down those results. As I mentioned, creating new scenarios this way for whatever type of scenario analysis you might want to do. Very easy to do. Copy an existing one, copy its rules, potentially copy its input data, and then start making modifications to that new point of view. Same thing, but on a more granular aspect with rules, rule management, we often need to copy and move rules. As metadata changes come in, there are times we need to do mass edits for a lot of rules that may have been relying on a specific member that we want to change. We can find and replace members in many rules at once. We can enable and disable rules, many of them at once, within each point of view. So, once we discovered once we've helped users build rules, they're very successful and they tend to build a lot of them. And then managing a lot of rules becomes a challenge. So we went one step further and built in those tools to help managing large numbers of rules. Sorry, I'm talking fast because I got limited time. Integration is the next step. We've got our structure defined, we've got our rules built. Now we need to bring in the data. I kind of in a circular fashion, master data as well, but forgive me for skipping over that. With a typical PCM project, we're going to see a lot of integration points. It's the ledger plus other things, and that list of other things, it depends on the use case, depends on the customer that we're dealing with and where they have usable data. But typical integration points are the GL, often planning, because we're often used as an allocation support system for planning for those shared service allocations in a forecast scenario. Sometimes from consolidation, if we're working with multinationals in particular and trying to do something at as aggregated level, we're often pulling actuals from financial close. Operational data coming from a lot of sources, sometimes the subledgers, sometimes a project systems, sometimes customer interaction systems, timekeeping systems, warehousing and logistics systems, surveys of people. Lots of different places that we're getting sometimes additional breakdown of financial data, but most often driver data, statistical values that we're going to use for doing a good cause and effect defined allocation. Often has to come from external systems, and it's not present in any of the financial systems. So, bringing together that data and master data systems, and this is the part I skipped over because we need dimensions to get this far. But to get those dimensions, often we have to get them from a master data system, on premises Hyperion DRM, or in the cloud Oracle EPM, or other systems entirely. Where hierarchy management lives within an any organization is usually in many places. And for PCM, we're usually getting kind of a hybrid. Some of our dimensions are coming from some place that's managing the master data. Some of the dimensions are simply constructed specifically for PCM. And so, we have to support multiple ways to get that information in. So we offer multiple integration options. As with all of the Oracle Cloud EPM products, we've got a native integration method. So, file-based loads for dimension definitions and data values are always there. For data, we've always got the SmartView Excel plugin, so we can get data that way as well, especially for, that's especially useful for small amounts of data from a variety of human-based sources, for surveying. But we can also get, we probably get the bulk of our data through EPM Cloud's data exchange utility. And this is the same data exchange, used to be called data management load utility that all of the EPM Cloud products have, and is the cloud successor to the old on-premises Hyperion FDMEE. Those on-premise products are also potential sources for PCM. We recognize that not all customers have moved exclusively to a cloud footprint yet, and still have some of this stuff in on-premise, and some of it may remain that way. So those are also integration points for PCM, as well as EDM in the cloud. So the master data management, I'll just spend a brief minute here. EDM in the cloud really kind of is the best solution we've got, and we can EDM can be used for lots of things besides PCM, but certainly it is a great orchestrator of master data for across EPM, as well as the Oracle ERP footprint, as well as third parties. So we've got a wide range of dimension integration options, with the best being EDM. And for data exchange, I have just kind of a quick illustration of the variety of things that we'll see with data exchange. And you've probably seen this similar presentation to planning, because honestly, getting data in and out of the other EPM cloud products and PCM largely is similar. Data exchange is what we use for the bulk of the work, and use its on-premises agent to trigger exports from on-premises systems that data exchange can pick up, integrate with the cloud products. And this is where some of the modeling intelligence starts with data exchange, because, as I was mentioning earlier, we don't have to load data at the detail we get it. In cases where we don't need it at the detail, we'll get it. And often we'll see this with raw account balances coming up to PCM, where for management reporting purposes, if we don't have to round trip back to a ledger, we don't need all of that detail. We need it pooled. And so data exchange helps us with that mapping into pools as a first step of transformation. Okay, next step, we've got a structure, we've got logic and rules, we've integrated data. Now we need to run some calculations. And here again was an area where we saw that this was a challenge in other systems, legacy systems. It's a challenge in your ledger. Honestly, to some extent, it's a challenge in planning, because the processing of all of these rules is, it's kind of intrusive to other people's use of those systems. So, offloading this really disruptive process of calculating and recalculating data is one of the benefits of bringing it over to PCM, and let that, disruption happen within the confines of PCM while we're working out the results, and then bring them back to either planning or the ledger or other places. But that process is difficult, because running and rerunning things is necessary when you're aggregating data from a lot of places. You need to check and validate, make sure you don't have data quality issues with drivers. When you're building out rules, you need to test them. So, running these calculations is a messy business, and PCM does a good job of keeping it contained to a lab in a lot of ways, but also making the process simple for a business user. So rather than triggering scripts, we present the user with kind of a rules-based approach where each rule has a title. And when you're running rules, we give you a relatively straightforward interface for running them. Which point of view do you want to run, or do you want to run many points of views? Run them with a common set of rules, run them with unique rules. Common set of rules, classically kind of the forecast scenario. Your rules are going to be all the same for 12 periods. Do you want to run all of the rules, some of the rules, or just one rule? And what options do you want to take here? Do you want to clear all the previous results? Do you want to execute rules and optimize is a kind of an S-space tuning trigger? But to be able to run, rerun, and clear, the process here is a single UI. And when we make this simple, we go a step further by making the bookkeeping under the hood simple as well. So we invented a way to track movement in the multidimensional database, movements related to these transformations and allocations in particular. And just for the fun of it, we patented it because it was a cool idea. So we got a patent a couple years ago on this. And the concept uses two additional dimensions. And these are the rule and balance dimension are dimensions that the system adds to your data and manages the movement and the kind of the allocation logic for the user behind the scenes. The user doesn't need to deal with rule and balance when they're defining rules. We're going to insert them for the user in as executions so that we can track every rule's impact on every data point it impacted and what type of move it caused. So the balance dimension is tracking for us the nature of the movement. Was it an allocation into a cell? Was it an allocation out of a cell? Was it an adjustment value? And the rule dimension is going to track which rule caused that movement to happen. So this gives us a number of really cool capabilities. One, it's absolutely clear, rule by rule, what caused movement to happen. This ability, because one of the things we do here is we never impact the input values. So whatever was imported, we actually never touch that value in the database. We only add changes to it. And those changes are tracked by rule. So this gives us the ability to do an unlimited number of runs, reruns, clears, recalculate, and so on, without the user having to worry about either the sequence in which things were done, or how to start over, restoring data from a backup if that was what was necessary in the past. So without this ability to track impact by rule and type, trying to do these allocation processes and then redo or undo them gets really messy. So the rule and balance dimension are kind of the hidden heroes of the calculation engine to help manage that process and make the process of doing calculations and recalculation a simple one-screen, couple of mouse clicks operation. Once we've calculated, now we need to look at our results. So validation really starts kind of at the high level. The rule balancing screen is really the first stopping point after a calculation has completed, and it's going to show you for the point of view that you calculated every rule in the order it executed and every specific impact those rules had at a summary level. So you can verify obviously that rules balance, and they should verify the amounts that rules are moving. And if you're familiar with your data, you should have a fairly good idea of what impact your rules should be having on your data, and you can give kind of rules an at-a-glance view of what kind of numbers are being moved by the rules. You can filter this view so that we can see the rule impacts on just a portion of your database. If we wanted to see, for instance, a particular business unit that's a supporting business unit that we expected to see all of the funds allocated out into other business units, we could see the remainder value on this screen start to drop to zero if we had a filter in place. So this is a great first place to review the impacts of your rules at a high level. To see them in detail, all of the blue text on screen is drillable. So you can drill into SmartView and see the specific detail of what each rule did. Along the way, for every customer, validating performance and checking for performance is one of the key things. We track performance by rule, script generation time, execution time, numbers of cells of data, etc. So the execution report is a great place to start tuning rules or finding rules that need tuning for maybe better performance. We are also documenting all of the rule logic, and when you define a rule, you give it a name and a description, and we will produce a report. This is a one-click report that we produce. It shows the allocation process for this point of view from start to finish, rule set and rule, descriptions and definitions of rule in one PDF file. This is a great tool for explaining to a casual user or a casual inquisitive user what the process is. This is an even better tool for starting conversations with third-party auditors that want to know what your allocation process looks like. This way you don't need to walk them through screens. You can start with a report that describes the logic and move from there. Metadata validations we've again built in because you change your metadata, it can have impact on the rules and other artifacts. So making checks on those things is something we've built in. Sorry, I'm speeding along because I know I'm coming up against Q&A time here in a few minutes. And finally, once we've got the process done, sharing that information, sharing information out in some understandable fashion. And PCM has dashboards built in. PCM has a couple of other specialty views like the profit curve there that can arrange profit objects from most to least profitable and kind of show you the distribution of your profit performers and give you the ability to do some category breakdowns. There's many delivery options, built-in dashboards, financial reports are there, smart view, profit and trace screens, export data by query, and integrating this with other EPM systems like EPBCS to combine with planning information and use in common dashboards. All kinds of solutions there isn't really a typical one. Usually data from PCM is by and large going somewhere else. So the built-in reporting is often used by the close project team for building reports that help validate, but usually the data from PCM is going to some larger warehouse for dissemination to other users, but often going in somewhat of a aggregated fashion. So we see more and more users coming back into PCM because in PCM we've got that rule and balance dimension. We've got the all of the low-level details so that investigations of causation, we've always got the data. We can always trace from end to end, and once users start reacting to the results they see, perhaps see some break-even performance they thought were doing better than expected, or some that are actually in the red in terms of profit, they might want to come back and look at causation and start to understand what's causing the costs to exceed the revenues for these groups that they had thought were doing better than expected. So initial use of the project is to create the data, get it back somewhere else. A few months later, we'll see more users trickle back in to start doing analysis, and that's when they come back into PCM to start to analyze those cause and effect relationships. So we got Speedy there at the end, so we got some time for questions. We'll open up the floor, and Danielle, how are we taking questions? Through Q&A or unmute?
Yes, sir. We just have them. I'll kind of keep an eye on the chat box as well, because sometimes they'll come through there. But the easiest to keep them all in one place, there's that Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom toolbar that people can send through there. And don't worry too much. I mean, we have really till the top of the hour, so I apologize for not communicating that earlier, making you feel a little rushed on there. But yeah, we definitely have time for as many questions as people want to send in.
Okay, well, I thought we were 45, so we've got time for questions and a cup of coffee or tea.
That's right. Too early for happy hour quite yet. Maybe 5 o'clock somewhere.
Okay, I may have stunned them to silence. So if we don't have questions, by all means, Mark and I are available via email and or through the Salesforce. So if questions come up, clarifications in any way, shape, or form we can help you, please don't hesitate to reach out. And I guess, Danielle, what's next?
Don, maybe you can just kind of address commonly asked questions. I know that I often get questions around data, data management. I know you've addressed some of those points, and maybe there's also some unique industry use cases or any commonly asked questions that you get.
Boy, I get all the weird ones. Maybe the first question is, around does this round trip to the GL? The answer is yes, if you want it to. Kind of the use case dictates that. If we're being used as a support function for the ledger to do allocations of shared service groups that those results need to be back in the ledger for statutory reports, then yes, we round trip data back to the ledger. Same way we would round trip data back to planning, because we're often used for the same purpose in planning, in doing those overhead allocations for a budget.
Yeah, good point. And a couple good questions have just started coming in. So first one here, why would you leverage PCM over traditional EPBCS applications, specifically for an integrated retailer? So in retail industry in particular, why do allocations EPBCS versus PCM?
Sure. So just to be clear, I would never use PCM for planning and budgeting, so I wouldn't be replacing EPBCS for that function. But for a retailer that is doing any of the things, kind of the use cases that we talked about earlier, shared service recharges across departments or business units, or even product segment profitability and allocations of expenses, especially for that last one, that's introducing a lot of often large dimensions that in an EPBCS application can kind of get in the way of the planning process. Often profitability is desired at a level that's going to help marketeers, but not necessarily at a level where you plan. So, introducing dimensions to support profitability analysis in EPBCS in your planning system might introduce a lot of large dimensions and overhead that kind of get in the way of the traditional planning process. The other point is you can do allocations in planning. You can do them in a lot of places, but all of the features I just went through are all features that PCM built to make the allocation management process easier that EPBCS doesn't have. So, EPBCS can do allocations, there's no doubt. Trying to manage a waterfall of a couple hundred of them is tough in EPBCS.
Yeah, good question. I mean, to me, it's kind of like planning. I love planning. I'm responsible for both planning and profitability cost management. But we spend all our time trying to optimize planning for purposes of planning, budgeting, and forecasting. And Don and the team spend all of their time optimizing the tool for that. So it's the right tool for the right process. And a bunch of good questions coming in now, Don. Good question here. I like this one. How is PCMCS application different from allocation features in the ERP? So for their Oracle ERP, presumably.
Good one. There's functional difference, and then there's just kind of fact of life differences. And the fact of life differences, I'll hit first. One, in PCMCS, we can modify the dimensions you're working with. It doesn't have to just be the segments that are in the ERP, because often the desire for profitability analysis requires additional products or customer or channel detail that is only in the ledger, or perhaps not even in the ledger. If it is in the ledger, it was only there for that reporting purpose. So adding segments to the ledger just for profitability analysis is essentially bloating your ledger with things that are getting in its way. So one of the key reasons we see allocation processes move from the ledger to PCM is to allow PCM to deal with that additional dimensionality and prevent it from becoming additional chart field segments in the ledger, and to keep the ledger slim and quick. For management reporting purposes, especially, people that are moving to PCM are trying to get that out of the ledger. Okay. Some other ones here.
A couple of good data integration questions on here. I'll read both of them. Actually, they're kind of related. Is EPM data integration fully usable by PCM? And then, all three of these are data related, but another one is, what's the best way to connect between EPBCS and PCMCS to transfer data and metadata?
I'll take the second one first. Data management, data exchange. And I use both because in the PCM UI right now, it still says data management. In EPBCS, it says data exchange, but they're really the same engine under the hood. And the truth is, you can use the data exchange instance on EPBCS to feed PCM. They're really the same engine, and it's not tied to one particular environment. So you can use a centralized instance of it to orchestrate between multiple pods. So data exchange is really the best solution. The other question was, is EPM data integration fully usable by PCM? Yes, it is. There are a couple of quirks right now, just in version differences that we've got between EPBCS data exchange and PCM's data management. The UI is a little bit behind, but again, you're not limited to the using the UI that's on PCM. You can use the one on EPBCS and feed PCM.
Okay, great. And then another good question, great questions here, actually. How seamless are the integrations to non-Oracle applications? And then also, so that would presumably be third party, and then also to Oracle projects, so Oracle Fusion projects, to pull or feed data from allocations?
So to non-Oracle applications, it's largely the same thing. And remember, this is basically asking, how do we integrate with the rest of the entire world? And the answer on how that's done is always, it depends, but it starts with data management and data exchange. To fetch data from PCM or really any of the EPM cloud products and pull it out into a file base that can then be moved on to either Oracle Cloud Integrator or other transformation tools, or directly to the third-party applications import mechanism that they use. So it's going to be file-based to the rest of the world, and depending on where we're going is what the requirements are going to be. In terms of Oracle projects, Mark, do we have I thought we might have a project coming related to projects for data exchange. Are you aware of that?
That is correct. Yeah, I talked about that yesterday in our planning session, but we do have integration between the EPM Cloud and Fusion projects. It'll be coming very soon, as just the way I'll say it, with safe harbor statement. Yeah, right. That is coming soon.
Okay,
that's all the questions we have.
I like that.
Awesome. Sometimes it just takes a minute or so to get those typed in, right?
Right.
And then
exactly. Get the juices flowing.
Exactly. Well, thank you guys so much. That was a great session. I know we hit over, I think, 60 participants, so that was fantastic. But I think if we don't have any other questions, I think we're good to go.
Okay. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Danielle.
Thanks for the invite and the chance to talk about PCM, because I'm all about that. So anyone that has additional questions, by all means, reach out, and everyone have a good day.